They told everyone I had already made my own success. That's why I didn't deserve a cent of the family fortune. I smiled even as my father announced it in front of 200 guests and TV cameras. Then I reminded them calmly who actually saved the company they were toasting. By morning, the clip had gone viral, and the truth they buried finally surfaced. I'm Madeline Carter, and this is how one toast ended a lifetime of silence. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The lights inside the Monarch Grand Ballroom shimmered like liquid gold pouring over the marble floors and glass chandeliers. The jazz band played something soft, something that didn't match the way my stomach twisted. 200 guests in tuxedos and sequined gowns floated around the room like swans, all of them pretending this was love. I walked in beside my mother, Eleanor, her arm linked through mine as if we were simply another proud pair of wedding guests. She smiled, too wide. I didn't. From across the room, my father stood near the stage, shaking hands, laughing like a man who had built an empire from his own bare hands instead of from other people's sacrifices. His silver hair gleamed under the chandeliers, and his smile, so practiced, so performative, made my skin tighten. Beside him stood Thomas, my brother, his tuxedo, spotless, his champagne glass raised in the air, as though he were already the prince inheriting a crown. I caught his eyes for just a second. He smirked. The same smirk he used when he got away with everything as a child. I turned my gaze away and focused on the flickering candles on each table. I could hear my own breath over the hum of conversation. In my mind, I could still hear myself 8 years earlier promising my father I'd fix what he had broken. I could still see the late nights, the endless reports, the weight of a company that had been dying until I gave it my life. I had believed then that even if love was out of reach, respect was not. But as I watched him now, laughing, basking in his favorite son's glow, I understood how foolish that hope had been. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne flutes. I took one mostly to have something to hold. The bubbles rose and popped against the crystal. The jazz faded as my father stepped onto the small stage. The microphone squealed slightly before his voice filled the ballroom. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his tone rich, rehearsed. "Thank you for being here to celebrate my son's wedding. Tonight isn't just about family, it's about legacy." He turned toward Thomas, placing a proud hand on his shoulder. "Carter Interiors, the company I built from the ground up, the symbol of everything I've achieved, will belong to him. $45 million in assets, the next generation of our family's success." He paused, and I knew the words before they left his mouth. "My daughter Madeline." He continued, glancing toward me with a polite smile that cut sharper than any insult, has her own life, her own success. She doesn't need a penny from me. A ripple of laughter moved through the room, soft but poisonous. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others clapped to fill the silence. My mother's smile faltered. Thomas lifted his glass in triumph. My hand trembled around my drink, though my face stayed still. Inside, everything slowed. The lights, the laughter, the band starting another tune. I stared at my father and thought about every bill I had paid, every contract I had saved, every promise I had believed. Respect. That was the most expensive illusion of all. My heart beat once, twice. I felt my heels dig into the carpet as I stepped forward just enough that the nearest tables turned toward me. My voice was clear, steady, louder than I expected. "If that's how it is," I said, meeting my father's eyes, "then maybe your son should also be the one to repay the $3 million I borrowed to save your company." The words seemed to echo longer than they should have. The band stopped. Every fork froze midair. My father's expression emptied the practiced smile, collapsing. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Thomas blinked, his smirk fading. Somewhere near the back, a phone camera lifted. Someone whispered. The clink of a single champagne flute tipping over was the only sound. I let the silence stretch, the weight of it pressing against the glass walls, the chandeliers, the gold, and the laughter that had died too fast. My father looked at me as if he didn't recognize me. Maybe he never had. I felt my pulse calm the same way it did before every hard decision I'd ever made. I set my glass down carefully on the nearest table. They thought I'd cry. I heard myself think, as if narrating my own undoing. But I stopped crying for them a long time ago. Without another word, I turned and walked away, my heels clicking against the marble, each sound sharper than applause. Behind me, no one spoke. The music didn't start again. Only silence followed me out the door. The smell of stale coffee and printer toner still lived in my memory like a ghost. It was 2016, and the office of Carter Interiors felt colder than any January in Los Angeles had the right to be. The lights flickered above me, half the bulbs burned out, the carpets worn down to threads. I sat at my father's old oak desk staring at the numbers on the financial report. Negative columns, debt, $2.8 million owed to the bank, vendors waiting, payroll overdue. The company was bleeding out, and my father didn't even look worried. He sat across from me, legs crossed, cigar smoke curling above his head. "If you think you have what it takes," he said, his voice flat, "then save it. Save what I built." He didn't say please. He never did. I remember the weight of his words pressing against my ribs, the quiet humiliation that came with realizing this wasn't a request. It was a dare. I could have walked away. I had a good position in San Francisco, a loft with a view of the bay, a life that was mine. But some part of me still wanted his approval, or at least to prove that I didn't need it. 2 weeks later, I signed the loan papers. $3 million. My condo in Santa Monica became collateral, my savings emptied. The banker looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I was. The conference room smelled like new paper and fear, and when the pen hit the signature line, I felt something inside me close. A door that would take years to reopen. I threw myself into the work like a soldier with no backup plan. The office became my home, the employees my only company. I called suppliers one by one, renegotiated every contract. I walked through the warehouse with a clipboard and a flashlight checking inventory at 2 a.m. I made coffee for the overnight crew, rolled up my sleeves, and packed orders when we were short-staffed. I learned the names of every worker on the floor. When the numbers started to turn, I barely noticed. It was survival. Meetings blurred into nights into mornings. I stopped answering calls from friends. My mother called every few days, her voice soft over the phone. "Your father will come around, sweetheart. He's just proud in his own way. Pride doesn't pay interest, Mom." I said, staring at the stack of unpaid bills. "I don't need him to say he's proud. I just need him not to destroy what's left." She sighed, and I could hear the sound of her stirring tea in the background. "You sound like him when you're angry." That scared me more than anything. By the end of that year, we'd cut costs by 40% and landed a new contract with a luxury hotel chain in Palm Springs. Slowly, the company started to breathe again. The warehouse lights stayed on, but the panic was gone from the workers' faces. Bonuses returned. I watched it happen like someone who'd been underwater too long, afraid to believe in air. In 2017, my father started showing up again. He would walk through the office, shake hands, talk about his team. He smiled for photos in trade magazines saying Carter Interiors had turned a corner. He never mentioned me, not once. It shouldn't have mattered. I told myself that over and over. But every time I saw his hand on another executive's shoulder, pride in his eyes, I felt something small and bitter take root inside me. The night before our annual conference, I stayed late in the office, reviewing the quarterly report. The numbers looked good, better than they ever had. I thought maybe this time he'd say something, anything. I even wore the navy suit he once said made me look like a real executive. The ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel buzzed with clients and journalists. My father took the stage microphone in hand, champagne already in his system. He spoke of rebuilding, of vision, of family legacy. I stood in the back, holding my glass, pretending to blend in with the crowd. And none of this. He said smiling toward the front row would have been possible without Thomas bringing his energy and ambition back to our brand. The applause was immediate. I saw Thomas stand up, grinning, soaking in the praise. My heart thudded once hard like it wanted out. I looked down at my hands. They were steady, but the champagne in my glass trembled. My throat burned. Afterward, Thomas came up to me, clinking his glass against mine. "Not bad, huh? Guess the old man finally sees what I can do." I forced a smile. Guess he does. He didn't notice that I didn't drink. Later, I stood outside the hotel, while the city hummed below me, the air thick with exhaust and laughter. I could still hear my father's voice echoing in the ballroom behind me. I whispered to no one. I thought I'd at least get a thank you. The streetlights blurred, and for a moment I didn't know if the sting in my eyes was anger or exhaustion. Probably both. By 2018, Carter Interiors hit $50 million in revenue. Trade magazines called it a comeback story. My father was on the cover, smiling like a man who'd never failed. Thomas stood beside him in every photo. I wasn't in any of them. Back at the office, a copy of that magazine sat on my desk. I stared at it for a long time before turning it face down. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the hum of machines I had paid for. In my mind, my voice whispered again, steady and tired. I thought respect was something you earned, but in this family it was just something you inherited. I reached for my phone to call my mother, then stopped. There was nothing left to say. The city lights blinked outside the window, and I realized how long it had been since I'd seen the ocean. Maybe that was when the distance between us began, not the distance of miles, but of truth. The view from the top-floor conference room of Carter Interiors had always been my quiet refuge. From there, downtown Los Angeles looked endless, lines of glass towers, cars glinting like silver threads in the sun. But that morning in 2023, the view only reminded me how high the fall could be. My father stood at the head of the table, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Everyone, I want to welcome Thomas back to the company." He smiled as if we had all been waiting for this moment. He's learned a lot these past few years, and starting today, he'll be taking over as our chief operating officer. Applause broke out thin and awkward. The younger staff clapped because they didn't know better. The older ones avoided looking at me. I sat across from my father, pen resting against my notepad, trying not to crush it between my fingers. Thomas stood beside him, the picture of ease. Tan confident, wearing a designer suit that screamed second chances. "It's good to be back," he said, like he was returning from war instead of crawling home after a failed startup in Texas. My father gestured toward me. "Your sister will help you transition. She knows the systems better than anyone." I felt my pulse tighten. "Dad," I said evenly. "Thomas has never managed a budget in his life. You're putting the company at risk." He didn't even look at me. "This family needs a successor, Madeline, not a skeptic." A small silence fell. I glanced at Thomas. He smirked. "Come on, Mads. Try to relax. You handle the numbers. I'll handle the vision. Is that what you call it?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp. "Vision." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You're great with spreadsheets, but leadership? Leadership takes guts." I looked straight at him. "Maybe. But guts don't pay bills. And last time I checked, it takes numbers to keep the lights on." My father's eyes flickered toward me, irritation thinly veiled by a corporate smile. "Enough. This isn't a debate. Thomas is my decision." It wasn't just a decision. It was a message. Years of sacrifice erased with a single announcement. When the meeting ended, everyone filed out with polite murmurs. Thomas lingered near the window, admiring the skyline as if he owned it. "You don't have to look so worried, sis. I'm not here to take your job. I'm here to fix your mess." I turned to face him. "My mess." He shrugged. "You saved the company once, sure, but maybe it's time someone actually grew it. You've kept it safe, not successful." I felt something twist inside me, but my face stayed still. "Maybe you're right," I said. "I don't talk as much as you. I just work." He grinned. "That's what I like about you. Predictable." Later that afternoon, an email arrived from his new office. Subject line, document update, financial authorization. It was a request for my signature on what he called a minor adjustment to the 2016 loan file. I forwarded it to Ava Sinclair, my attorney and oldest friend. 10 minutes later she called. "Maddie, don't you dare sign that." Why I asked, though, I already felt the weight in my stomach. "Because there's a clause buried in it," she said. Page 3, small print. "It transfers ownership of the collateral. Your personal guarantee, from you to the company. If you sign, your claim disappears. Completely." I walked to the window, the city below, flickering with afternoon haze. "He wants to erase my leverage." "Exactly," Ava said. "It's a setup. He or your father, probably both." I almost laughed, but it came out hollow. "Of course it is. So what are you going to do?" "Nothing," I said quietly. "At least not yet. Maddie, I'll ask them to send a hard copy to legal for review. That'll buy us time." I hung up and opened the document again. The words blurred neat legal language hiding the same old betrayal. I printed it, scanned it into my private drive, then slid the paper into a folder labeled Proof. That night, the office emptied slowly. I stayed late, the hum of the city below like static in my ears. Thomas's new office light glowed across the hall, though I doubted he was still there. He never was one for late nights. I stood in the doorway looking at the nameplate that now read Thomas Carter, COO. My father's handwriting was still on the glass, bold and proud. My phone buzzed. A text from Ava Keep. Every email. "Don't trust a word until you see the ink." I typed back, "I know. This time, I'm not believing promises. I'm keeping proof." As I packed my briefcase, I glanced at the framed photo on my desk, one of the few times we'd all smiled back in 2010, when the company had finally turned a profit. We looked like a family then. But even in that picture, my father's hand rested on Thomas's shoulder. Not mine. I switched off the lights, the office falling into shadow. Through the glass walls, Los Angeles glimmered careless and alive. I locked the door behind me, whispering under my breath. I used to believe in them. Now, I believe in evidence. The elevator doors slid shut, and for the first time in years, I felt the strange calm that comes when you finally stop expecting anyone to save you. The late afternoon light spilled through the kitchen windows, painting soft gold across the countertops. I had opened the windows earlier to let in the spring air, but it only made the silence feel heavier. I heard the knock before I saw her. 3 gentle taps, polite as always. My mother stood at the door, holding a pie box and wearing that same cautious smile she used whenever she came bearing news I wouldn't like. "I brought your favorite," she said. "Apple," I asked, even though I already knew. She nodded, stepping inside. Her perfume, faint and floral, filled the space. It smelled like Sunday dinners when I was still too young to understand what disappointment felt like. I poured her a cup of tea while she carefully cut a slice for me. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the sunlight catching in her silver hair. She tried to sound casual. "Thomas called this morning. He and Lily have set a date for the wedding, next month in Beverly Hills. Your father's very excited." I looked down at the steam rising from my cup. "I'm sure he is." There was a pause long enough for both of us to feel it. She set her fork down. "Maddie, don't be angry with your father. He's under a lot of pressure right now." I met her eyes. "Pressure isn't an excuse to lie to your daughter, Mom." Her lips tightened. "He didn't lie. He just manipulated," I said quietly, "omitted. Took something that wasn't his." She looked down, fingers twisting her napkin. "You've always been so strong. You don't understand what it's like to be married to a man who demands control. I understand it more than you think," I said. "I worked for him." Her shoulders sank. For a moment, she looked smaller, like the years had suddenly caught up to her. "Your father told me to put my name on that loan years ago. He said it was to protect the company from scrutiny. I didn't question it. I thought it was his money." The words sank in slowly, one by one. My hand stilled on the cup. "What loan?" "The one that saved the company back in 2016? She said softly. "He told me it was between us, that it was better this way. But it wasn't his money, was it?" I pushed back my chair and stood, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I walked to the hallway cabinet, pulled open the bottom drawer, and took out the old black binder I kept locked away. Inside were the copies of the 2016 transactions, loan statements, bank authorizations, wire confirmations. My handwriting was still on the signature lines. I flipped to the page marked March 3rd, 2016. Eleanor Carter, listed as guarantor. I stared at the numbers. 3 million, the same account, my funds. She watched me from the table, eyes wet. "I didn't know, Maddie. I swear I didn't. He said you'd already agreed to it. He said it was part of your job." I turned toward her, the binder trembling in my hands. "He used you to steal from me." Her voice broke. "He said he'd pay you back when things were stable." I let out a sound. Half laugh, half disbelief. "Stable? He's been stable for 8 years, Mom. The company thrives. Thomas gets promoted, and I'm the fool who paid for it all." She pressed a napkin to her eyes. "Your father isn't a bad man, Maddie. He's proud. He doesn't know how to say thank you." "Pride isn't harmless," I said, closing the binder. "It's how people justify cruelty." She looked up at me, her voice trembling. "You sound just like him when you're angry." That stopped me. For a second, I didn't know if she meant it as a warning or an accusation. I sat down again, the binder still clutched in my lap. "I'm not him," I said quietly. "I've spent my whole life trying not to be him." She reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were cold, paper-thin, shaking slightly. "I wish you didn't have to be the strong one all the time. I didn't pull away." For the first time, I saw her not as the mother who stayed silent, but as the woman trapped inside a marriage built on fear and appearances. We sat there for a long time without speaking. The light outside dimmed, shifting from gold to gray. I could hear the clock ticking in the next room. Finally, I said, "Mom, you helped him do it." "You didn't mean to, but you did." She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I know. And I'm sorry." I stood, walked around the table, and wrapped my arms around her shoulders. She felt fragile in my arms, her breath uneven. For a moment, I didn't feel angry, just tired. "Mom," I whispered, "I'm not going to keep pretending this is normal. I'm done being quiet." She nodded against my shoulder. "I know, sweetheart." When I pulled back, her eyes were red, but she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that breaks instead of comforts. As she left, the house felt heavier. I stood by the door, watching her car pull away down the street, headlights fading. The air smelled like apples and smoke. I turned off the kitchen light and leaned against the counter. The binder still in my hand. My voice echoed softly in my own head, steady and final. She was a victim of love. But I'm done being one. Outside, the sky over West Hollywood darkened, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to resolve instead of guilt. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, slipped under my apartment door, like something that had wandered out of another decade. My mother's handwriting hadn't changed in years. Elegant looping, careful as if good penmanship could make bad news sound softer. "The family needs to come together," it read. "Your brother's wedding is next month. Please, Madeline, don't let the past ruin this moment." I set the letter on the counter, staring at it, while sunlight spilled across the tile floor. Outside, the street hummed with delivery trucks and the faint bark of someone's dog. Normal life kept moving, indifferent to whatever chaos was waiting in that envelope. My phone buzzed. Ava's name flashed across the screen. So she said when I picked up her tone already wary. "You got it, yeah," I said, still staring at the paper. Handwritten, classy touch. "Are you going?" "I'll go," I said, my voice steady. "Not to forgive, to finish." There was a pause, the kind of silence that only exists between people who know exactly what the other is thinking. "Then we do this on your terms," Ava said. I folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it in the drawer beside my kitchen sink. I didn't need to read it again. Across town that same morning, Carter Interiors held a press conference. I watched it from my laptop, the company's logo gleaming on the backdrop like a monument I had built and no longer owned. My father stood at the podium, smiling that same politician's smile. "We're proud to announce the expansion of Carter Interiors nationwide," he said. "Thomas's leadership will take this company into its next great chapter." Thomas stepped forward, crisp suit, perfect grin, radiating borrowed confidence. "This is just the beginning," he said into the microphone. The applause that followed sounded rehearsed. An email from Ava popped up on my screen. Subject: "You need to see this." I opened the attachment. It was a legal notice from the state business registry. "They're transferring shares," Ava said over the phone. "Your father is officially moving majority ownership to Thomas, before the wedding." I exhaled slowly. Of course he is. They're making it look like a succession plan. It's smart, public, clean. By the time you react, it'll be done. "It's always been about timing with him," I said. "And ego. You should come by." Ava said, "I have something else." 2 hours later, I walked into the coffee shop near her office in West Hollywood. The air smelled like espresso and vanilla. She was already seated by the window, a manila folder open in front of her. "You're not going to like this," she said, pushing the papers across the table. I slid into the seat opposite her and began reading. The first document looked familiar. My name, my signature, the same loan reference from years ago. But below it, another form had been filed under my name for the last tax year. What is this? "It's a filing for interest deduction," Ava said. "Thomas used your personal taxpayer ID to claim a credit on the loan you paid. He's been doing it for 2 years. I stared at the page, the words blurring. He used my name. Yes. Which means if the IRS ever audits, you're the one on record. He gets the benefit, you get the liability. I sat back, pressing my fingers to my temples. He's not even creative with his betrayals anymore. Ava's expression hardened. "Maddie, this isn't just personal. This is criminal. He's banking on you not fighting back because it's family." I looked out the window. A family of 4 was crossing the street, the mother holding her daughter's hand. Something in my chest tightened. Family, I repeated. It's just a word people use when they want free forgiveness. Ava didn't respond. She didn't have to. Keep the documents safe, I said finally. Let them hang themselves with their own paperwork. Maddie, if you're thinking of confrontation, I'm not. I cut in. Not yet. She studied me for a moment, then leaned forward. What are you thinking? I traced the rim of my coffee cup with my finger, feeling the faint vibration of anger beneath my calm. They're planning a wedding, I said quietly. They want the whole world to see how perfect the Carters are. Ava's eyes narrowed. You're going. I nodded. I want them to have their stage. I just want to choose when the curtain falls. She closed the folder and slid it into her bag. Just promise me you'll be careful. People like your father don't lose gracefully. I know, I said, but neither do I. That night I walked home through the soft hum of the city. My phone lit up with a news alert about Carter Interiors. Photos of my father and Thomas shaking hands in front of the company's headquarters, smiling like kings of something permanent. The caption read, "A family business built to last." I laughed under my breath, the sound sharp and bitter. My reflection in a store window caught my eye. Tired, older than 38, but steady. Built to last, I murmured. We'll see. Back home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window. The envelope from my mother lay on the counter where I'd left it. I opened it again and reread the line she'd written. Please don't let the past ruin this moment. I folded it once more, slid it back into the drawer, and whispered to the empty room. The past isn't ruined. It's just waiting for its turn. For a long time, I watched the city lights blink on and off, one building at a time. Each flicker reminding me of the empire I'd built for someone else. The irony burned quietly, almost comforting. I didn't want revenge. Not yet. I just wanted the truth to do what it always does. Arrive exactly when it hurts the most. The lobby of the Monarch buzzed like a beehive, the air thick with perfume chatter, and the sound of crystal being polished for tomorrow's wedding. Every corner of the ballroom shimmered. White roses, silk ribbons, gold-trimmed place cards. I walked through it all quietly, watching a dozen strangers prepare for the performance my family was about to stage. Miss Carter. A young woman called. She wore a headset and carried a clipboard, the universal armor of wedding planners. I'm Olivia Reed. You're the groom's sister, right? Her smile flickered uncertain. I nodded. That's me. She hesitated before speaking again. I just wanted to say, people have been talking about you all morning. You know, after everything that's happened. Of course they have, I said, giving her a small, polite smile. That's what people do when they're bored. Olivia flushed, clearly wishing she hadn't said anything. Your dress fitting is this way. I followed her into one of the side suites where the tailor waited with the gown. The dress was simple, navy blue silk understated against the explosion of white that filled the rest of the hotel. I stepped into it, the cool fabric sliding over my skin, and faced the mirror. For a long moment, I just looked at myself. The woman in the reflection didn't look like someone who had once believed in her father's approval. Her eyes were sharper now, quieter. I've learned to smile when they mistake silence for weakness, I thought. The corner of my mouth lifted just enough to prove it. Outside, the noise of wedding preparation bled faintly through the walls. Laughter, the clink of champagne flutes, the rhythm of a life that never paused for conscience. Later that afternoon, I saw my father through the glass doors of a private conference room off the lobby. Gregory Hall, his longtime attorney, sat across from him with a folder open on the table. My father's voice was low, his gestures clipped and impatient. I lingered near the corner just long enough to catch a few words. Destroy the duplicates. I don't want those papers surfacing. Gregory's eyes darted nervously toward the window. Richard, this isn't something we can just do it, my father snapped. I'll handle the rest. I turned away before they saw me, my pulse steady, but my jaw tight. It wasn't fear I felt anymore. It was recognition. He wasn't covering up for me or for the company. He was covering up for himself. By evening, I was back at my apartment in West Hollywood. The city lights blinked lazily beyond the balcony, and the smell of spring rain drifted in through the open window. My mother arrived unannounced, knocking softly before letting herself in. She still wore her pearl earrings and carried a faint trace of perfume, as though she'd come straight from a dinner she didn't enjoy. She sat down on the sofa without waiting to be invited. Your father's nervous, she said after a moment. He's been under so much pressure lately. I think you should let tomorrow go smoothly, for everyone's sake. I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter. Scandal doesn't kill people. Mom, lies do. She looked up at me, her face tightening. He's not a bad man, Maddie. He wants to protect the family's name. The company's reputation means everything to him. Then he's already sold his honor, I said quietly. He just traded it for the right headline. She flinched, then shook her head, her voice small. You always see things in black and white. No, I said, sitting beside her. I see things for what they are. He's spent his whole life building a house of mirrors and calling it home. I just stopped pretending it reflects me. She looked at me with a kind of sad pride, the way mothers look at daughters they can't quite protect. You've become so much like him, she whispered. Strong, unforgiving. I took a slow breath. No, Mom. I've become what he should have been. Accountable. We sat in silence after that, the only sound the faint hum of the city below. When she finally stood, her voice trembled. Just try not to start anything tomorrow. I didn't answer. She kissed my forehead before leaving, the same gesture she used when I was a child. The door closed behind her, and I felt the distance settle again, familiar as gravity. I changed into a robe and walked to the full-length mirror in my bedroom. The reflection stared back, composed, unreadable. I touched the fabric of the navy dress hanging beside it, the one I'd wear to the wedding. It looked peaceful, deceptively so. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Ava lit the screen. IRS officially confirmed. They've opened the investigation. We just have to wait, I typed back. After the wedding, let them reveal themselves first, she replied with a single word, careful. I set the phone down, then stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain and jasmine. Los Angeles glittered below me, indifferent, eternal, full of people who'd never know the names Carter or Madeline. I found that comforting. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, echoing off the buildings before fading into silence. I leaned against the railing, watching the horizon blur into light. Tomorrow would be their show. The perfect wedding, the perfect family, the perfect lie. But tonight was mine. I wasn't scared anymore. Not of them. Not of what they might lose, and certainly not of what I'd already given up. The fear had burned out, leaving only clarity. I stayed there until the city dimmed, the night pressing softly against the glass. My reflection stared back at me, steady, unflinching. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure. The storm had already started. They just hadn't looked up to see it yet. The sun over Beverly Hills was merciless that afternoon, bright enough to turn the marble steps of the Monarch into a mirror. Photographers crowded near the entrance, their camera flashes like tiny bursts of lightning. Inside the ballroom glowed in soft gold, the air thick with parfum and the sound of a string quartet. White roses trailed across the tables. The champagne in each glass shimmered under the chandeliers. I walked in quietly, wearing a sea-green silk gown, simple, deliberate. The conversations around me dipped for a moment, just long enough for people to notice I was there. My mother spotted me first, her smile polite and trembling. My father didn't meet my eyes. Thomas stood near the center, his arm around his bride Lily, a vision in lace and diamonds. The orchestra played something old and romantic. I could almost laugh at how perfect it all looked. The air's too sweet, I thought. Happiness doesn't smell this artificial. A woman I barely knew brushed my arm as she passed. Madeline, you look lovely, she said too quickly. Behind her, 2 older guests whispered, not nearly as quietly as they thought. That's her. The daughter who used to run the company. Didn't her father? I caught the end of the sentence and smiled faintly. People love a tragedy, I murmured under my breath. Eleanor approached, holding my hand as if it might stop me from drifting too far. I'm glad you came, she whispered. Of course you are, I said softly. Every performance needs an audience. She winced, but said nothing. The ceremony itself passed in a haze of vows' applause and choreographed laughter. Thomas looked radiant, smug even. I sat through it all, quiet, detached, sipping water instead of champagne. When the music swelled for the first dance, I felt my pulse slow instead of quicken. I was waiting. Dinner followed. Toasts began, one after another. Friends, colleagues, people who'd barely known Thomas 5 minutes, but wanted to sound sentimental. Then my father rose. He didn't need a cue. The microphone practically sought him out. He smiled at the crowd, his voice steady practiced. Today, I'm not just celebrating my son's marriage. I'm celebrating the future of Carter Interiors. A family legacy, one I know will continue with pride and strength under new leadership. I could feel the shift in the room, the applause already forming before he said it. Thomas will be taking over as CEO in the coming quarter, he announced. Every asset, every property, every part of what I've built will belong to him. $45 million worth of legacy. And my daughter, Madeline, he added, turning his head just slightly in my direction, already has her own success. She doesn't need to rely on anyone. The applause that followed was thinner this time, uncertain. A few people clapped half-heartedly. Some just looked at me. Lily blinked awkward as if she hadn't been warned. My mother stared into her lap. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass. The sound of my heartbeat filled the silence between claps. Then I stood. Dad. I said, my voice calm even. If Thomas is inheriting everything, then I assume he's also inheriting the $3 million I loaned to save the company, right? For a moment, I thought maybe no one had heard me. Then one by one, the sounds in the room stopped. The laughter, the chatter, the clinking glasses, all of it collapsed into quiet. Thomas froze mid-smile. Lily turned pale. My father lowered his glass, his face blank. What did you say? He asked finally, though his tone wasn't confusion. It was warning. You heard me. I said, $3 million. The money that rebuilt Carter Interiors when it was bankrupt. The money that came from me. You remember, don't you? A ripple of whispers spread through the tables. A guest near the press section raised a phone discreetly recording. Someone coughed loud in the stillness. Madeline, my mother whispered. But I didn't look at her. My father's voice dropped low. This is not the time or place. It's the perfect time, I said. The whole family's here. The company's here. You should be proud to talk about how you built your empire. Thomas stepped forward, the grin gone from his face. You're out of line. I looked at him unblinking. And you're out of debt. At least you think you are. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. You're making a fool of yourself. No, I said. I'm just reminding everyone who's been footing the bill for this perfect family. A few guests gasped quietly. My father's hand trembled as he set his glass down. Enough, he hissed. I held his gaze, my voice dropping until it was almost a whisper. Enough pretending. For one suspended second, no one breathed. Then I set my champagne glass down on the nearest table. The sound of crystal against wood was sharp final. Congratulations, Thomas, I said. Looks like you've inherited everything. Including the truth. I turned and began walking toward the exit. The train of my gown brushing across the marble floor. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw phones raised, cameras flashing. Eleanor's shoulders shook silently. My father stared down, jaw clenched, his empire crumbling in front of 200 witnesses and a dozen lenses. The music never resumed. The room stood still, caught between shock and the realization that they had just witnessed something irreversible. As I reached the doors, I didn't look back. My reflection followed me in the mirrored walls, calm, composed, almost serene. They'll say I ruined the wedding, I thought, but all I did was peel away the mask. Outside, the California sun was still shining. It felt too bright for what I'd just done. I stepped into it anyway, breathing in the air like someone who had finally stopped pretending she was part of a family. 3 days later, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Every time I looked down, another notification lit the screen. Twitter, Instagram news alerts, text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. By noon, my name was trending. 45 million wedding toast. I sat on the couch of my small West Hollywood apartment, the curtains half drawn, the city humming outside, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. My laptop glowed on the coffee table. On every social platform there, it was the video from the wedding, grainy but clear enough. The microphone catching my voice, the look on my father's face, the silence that followed. The view count climbed by the second. 1 million. 2. 3. The comments flooded beneath it. She's a hero. What a disrespectful daughter. This family needs an IRS audit. Someone had slowed the footage down, looping my expression in slow motion. The calm, the precision, the glass being set down. They titled it, "The Coldest Toast in Beverly Hills." I watched it once, then closed the tab. My heartbeat was steady. I didn't feel proud. I didn't feel regret. Mostly, I felt still. The phone rang again. Ava. I assume you've seen it, she said, her voice quick but steady. I've seen enough, I replied. You're viral, Maddie. Half the country thinks you're an icon of justice. The other half thinks you need therapy. The press is eating this up. What's new? I said quietly. Sarah Lang just published a piece. Ava continued. Title, The Heiress Who Got Nothing. It's blowing up. People are demanding statements from Carter Interiors. Reporters have already camped outside your father's office. I leaned back against the couch, rubbing the bridge of my nose. And what's he doing? Pretending it's not happening. Of course he was. Denial was his first language. Listen, Ava said, her voice lowering. We need to be ready. If this gets bigger, he'll start blaming you. We both know how far he'll go to protect that image. I looked at the muted television screen across the room. A news ticker scrolled across the bottom. Carter Interiors responds to viral video. I unmuted it, just in time to hear my father's voice. My daughter is emotional, he said, standing at the steps of the company headquarters. She misunderstood some financial details. There's no family conflict here. Everything's fine. I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. He's still selling perfection, I said to Ava. You sound calm, she said. Too calm. When the truth starts talking, I said. I don't need to shout anymore. There was a pause on the line. I'll keep monitoring it, Ava said. Just be careful. After we hung up, the phone rang again almost instantly. This time, it was my father. The screen flashed. Carter. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering.
Do you have any idea what you've done? He roared. You're destroying my reputation. Our family's name. Your reputation, I corrected softly. You destroyed it yourself. I just stopped covering for you. Don't talk to me like I'm some villain in your little drama, he snapped. You're my daughter. Not according to your will, I said. There was silence, heavy and sharp. Then he said, You'll regret this. Maybe, I replied, but at least I won't regret telling the truth. I hung up before he could answer. That evening, the story hit national television. News anchors discussed the Carter wedding incident like it was a social experiment. A reporter stood outside the Monarch, pointing to the same marble steps where I had walked out days before. They replayed the clip over and over, the soundbite of my words echoing like a confession. Then he should pay the $3 million I loaned to save his company. And then came the real breaking news. Sources confirm the IRS has opened a preliminary review into Carter Interiors following the viral controversy. I froze, glass of water halfway to my lips. The screen showed Thomas, now smiling stiffly at a different podium, his tone rehearsed. My family is strong, he said. This has been blown out of proportion. We have nothing to hide. The camera zoomed in, catching the twitch in his jaw. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. My email pinged. A message from David Miller, the financial journalist Ava sometimes worked with. Subject internal source confirms tax irregularities and transfer fraud. Below it, a single line. The truth is about to get louder. Ava called again 15 minutes later. David's on it. He's already pulled filings from 2016 through 2022. There are gaps, missing disclosures. And now that the IRS is officially involved, they can't bury it. I closed my eyes. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. It's starting, I said. Maddie, once this snowballs, there's no undoing it. I don't want to undo it, I said. I just want it to end. We hung up, and I sat there for a long time, listening to the distant noise of traffic outside. My phone kept buzzing with notifications, praise, insults, questions, but I ignored them all. The truth had a way of spreading faster than gossip once it found air. For years I had been the silence they spoke over. Now silence belonged to them. I got up and poured myself a glass of wine, watching the city lights flicker through the window. The glow from downtown shimmered against the rim of the glass, red and gold. They laughed when I stayed quiet. I thought, lifting the glass slightly. Now they're the ones afraid to speak. I took a slow sip and let the night settle around me. The noise of the world dimmed, replaced by the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. Outside, Los Angeles kept shining, loud, hungry, endless, but inside my apartment, everything finally felt still. The IRS building downtown looked nothing like justice. Just a block of gray glass, silent and cold against the Los Angeles sky. A month had passed since the wedding, and the air around Carter Interiors had thickened into something heavy, like smoke before a fire. I stood outside the revolving doors that morning, watching agents in dark suits carry boxes into the lobby. Their reflections ghosted across the glass, sharp and unbothered.
A few reporters lingered behind the barricades, cameras ready. I recognized David Miller among them, the journalist who'd turned the whispers into headlines. Inside, the marble floors echoed with the click of polished shoes. A security guard directed me toward the conference level where the hearings were being held. When I stepped out of the elevator, I saw my father standing at the far end of the corridor, flanked by his lawyer, Gregory Hall. Thomas stood a few feet away, pretending to check his phone. Neither looked up. Ava met me by the door. "Ready?" she asked quietly. "I've been ready for years," I said. The hearing room smelled faintly of paper and nerves. The panel of IRS officials sat behind a long table, their expressions carved in stone. Rows of chairs lined the back for witnesses' attorneys, and, because the story had gone national, a handful of reporters granted special permission to observe. David caught my eye, briefly, notebook poised. I gave him a small nod. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about record. The lead investigator adjusted his glasses. "We'll begin with Mr. Gregory Hall," he said. Gregory walked stiffly to the front, his suit immaculate, his face gray. He swore an oath, then sat. His voice trembled slightly when he began. "In 2016, at the direction of Richard Carter, I prepared a document transferring the ownership of a personal loan guarantee from Madeline Carter to Carter Interiors, Inc." The words hit the room like a dropped pin in a cathedral. I kept my expression still. He continued, "Mr. Carter instructed me to file it as an internal adjustment. He said his daughter had agreed verbally. I believed him." The investigator's tone sharpened. "Did she?" Gregory hesitated, glancing toward my father. "No. I later discovered she had not. And that document was used as collateral for subsequent business loans." "Yes." His shoulders sagged. "Without her consent." The silence that followed was deafening. My father didn't move. His face was a mask, calm, expressionless eyes fixed on some invisible point across the room. When they called him next, I felt my heartbeat slow to a steady, deliberate rhythm. Richard Carter took the oath, sat, and folded his hands neatly on the table. "Mr. Carter," the investigator began. "Is it true you instructed your legal counsel to alter ownership documents relating to a $3 million personal loan?" My father's lips curved slightly. I signed what was put in front of me. I trusted my attorney to handle the details. Gregory's head snapped up, disbelief etched across his face. "That's not true." The investigator raised a hand. "Mr. Hall, you've had your time." Richard leaned back, confidence seeping back into his posture. "If my daughter misunderstood our arrangements, I regret that. But I did what was necessary for the company's survival. Necessary." The word made something cold move through me. A murmur rippled through the room. My turn came next. Ava touched my shoulder as I stood. "Stay measured," she whispered. I nodded and took the witness chair. "Ms. Carter," the investigator said, "what is your understanding of this loan?" "My understanding," I said, voice steady, "is that I took out a personal loan in 2016 to prevent Carter Interiors from defaulting. I was told it would be repaid. It never was. The documents in question were forged without my consent. I didn't even know about them until last year." I paused, looking toward my father. I thought I was helping my family. Turns out I was financing a lie. He didn't look at me. The investigator nodded, taking notes. Understood. As I stepped down, a rustle spread through the room. Someone new had entered. Heels clicking steady, familiar. I turned. It was my mother. Eleanor walked straight to the front, clutching a thin folder. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were clear. "I have evidence," she said quietly. The investigator motioned for her to proceed. She opened the folder and placed a stack of papers on the table. "These are the original loan documents kept by my sister Helen Monroe. They show that the funds came directly from Madeline's personal account. My husband knew this. For a moment, no one moved. The investigator flipped through the documents, comparing signatures. "These are authentic," he confirmed. "Ms. Carter, you've held these since 2016. I was told to keep them safe," she said, her voice cracking. "He said they were just backups. I didn't know he was using them to protect himself." She turned toward Richard, tears welling. "You used our daughter as a shield." The sound of cameras clicking broke the stillness. My father's mask finally cracked. His jaw clenched, a tremor at the edge of his composure. Thomas stood abruptly. "I didn't know about any of this," he blurted. "I thought everything was handled legally." The investigator raised a hand for silence. "We'll review further testimony." My father said nothing. His eyes were hollow, the confidence gone. Ava stepped forward for the closing statement. My client isn't seeking restitution, she said clearly. She isn't suing her family. She simply wants the truth recorded, publicly, permanently. That's all she ever asked for. The hearing adjourned a few minutes later. The sound of chairs scraping papers, rustling, people whispering. It all faded behind me as I walked out into the hall. The afternoon light spilled through the glass walls, blinding for a moment. I pushed through the doors and felt the warm air of Los Angeles hit my face. Outside, David Miller waited on the steps, notebook in hand. "Anything you want to say on record?" he asked. I shook my head. The record just spoke for itself. He smiled, slightly lowering the pen. Fair enough. As I stepped down the marble stairs, the sunlight caught on the edge of my bracelet, flashing briefly like a spark. The city noise was distant, horns' voices, the world moving on. I stopped at the bottom step and looked up at the sky, the glare sharp in my eyes. Justice didn't need applause. It didn't shout. It only arrived when there was nothing left for anyone to lie about. 2 months later, the sound of the television filled my apartment again, but this time, it wasn't laughter or music. It was the low, clinical tone of reporters narrating the end of an empire. "The Carter Interiors bankruptcy hearing concluded this morning," the anchor said. "After decades as a family-run design firm, the company has officially dissolved, following federal charges of tax fraud and document falsification. Richard Carter, former CEO, faces up to 7 years in federal prison pending sentencing." The screen showed what was left of the company. The building half-empty, employees carrying boxes, a man on a ladder, prying the sign off the facade. Carter Interiors. The letters came down one by one, clattering against the ground. I sat at the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. Ava sat next to me, flipping through a folder of legal papers. She glanced at the screen, then at me. "We won," she said softly. I shook my head. No one wins when a family burns down its own house. For a while, neither of us spoke. Outside, a garbage truck rumbled by, and sunlight cut across the floor in long, broken lines. The city kept moving, indifferent as ever. The news cut to footage of Thomas leaving the courthouse, his face pale beneath the California glare. Thomas Carter, stripped of his corporate rights, declined to comment, the reporter said. Behind him, his wife. Lily walked briskly, eyes hidden behind sunglasses. By the next week, gossip outlets would confirm what everyone already knew: she'd filed for divorce. Richard's photo came next, my father in handcuffs, led from his home. The image was surreal, and yet expected. Former CEO Richard Carter was charged with tax evasion, falsifying loan documentation, and obstruction of justice. The voiceover continued. I looked away from the screen. "He always wanted control," I murmured. "Now he doesn't even have freedom." Ava closed the folder and leaned back. "What about your mother?" "She moved to Santa Monica," I said quietly. "A small apartment near the pier. She doesn't answer calls from the press. She says she likes the sound of the ocean. It drowns out everything else." Ava smiled faintly. "She deserves peace. So do we." I said. The following week, I signed the lease on a small brick office downtown, a space that smelled faintly of paint and possibility. The windows faced east, catching the morning light. The nameplate on the door read, M. Designs. Not Carter, just me. Ava walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, her heels echoing on the concrete floor. "It's strange," she said, looking around. "I thought starting over would feel louder." "It's supposed to feel quiet," I said. "Quiet means it's real." We spent that first day calling back former employees, the ones laid off during the restructuring, the ones who'd sent me quiet thank you notes after the investigation ended. Most didn't hesitate. By the end of the week, we had a full team. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone at my desk and wrote a letter by hand. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did, for showing up when it would have been easier to walk away. This company isn't built on legacy. It's built on loyalty. I left the letters on each desk folded neatly. It wasn't much, but it was honest. A week later, David Miller published his feature, From Disinherited Daughter to Whistleblower. How One Woman Dismantled a Dynasty. The headline made me cringe, but the story itself was fair. He ended it with a quote from me I barely remembered giving. "Justice doesn't destroy families. Lies do. I didn't call to correct him. One evening I stopped by my mother's new apartment. The air smelled of salt and warm bread. She looked smaller, gentler somehow, but more alive than she'd been in years. We had tea by the window while the sky over the pier turned orange. "You did what I never could," she said suddenly. Her voice was soft but clear. "You told the truth no matter who it hurt. It hurt me too," I admitted. She reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. "Yes, but sometimes pain is the only way out of someone else's shadow." When I left, she pressed a sealed envelope into my hand. "Read it when you're home," she said. Later that night, sitting at my desk in the new office, I opened it. The handwriting was hers, steady, graceful. "My dear Maddie, you've done what I didn't have the courage to do. You broke the cycle. Don't let the world make you bitter. You deserve to live, not just survive. Live for yourself now." By the time I finished reading, the paper was damp with tears I hadn't realized were falling. I laughed quietly at myself, wiping them away. It wasn't grief anymore. It was release. The TV in the background showed a rerun of the same report. Workers leaving the Carter Interiors building a faded logo above an empty door. But I didn't turn it off this time. I watched until the frame shifted sunlight flaring across the lens. It looked almost like rebirth. I set the letter beside the computer and whispered, "I thought justice would taste sweet." The city lights flickered outside the window, reflections moving across the glass. "But it doesn't," I said softly. "It just feels quiet." And for the first time in years, quiet felt like peace. The rain was soft that morning, a lazy drizzle that blurred the windows of the little cafe on Fairfax. I sat by the window, the same table I always chose, nursing a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, umbrellas drifted by like dark petals in motion, and the city felt quieter than usual, muted like it was holding its breath. The notebook in front of me was worn, its leather edges frayed. I flipped it open to a page marked in blue ink, 2016, Save the Company. The handwriting looked younger, hungrier. I ran my thumb over the words. For a long time they had felt like a badge of honor. Now they just felt like history. The doorbell chimed softly behind me. I looked up, half expecting no one, but there she was, my mother. Eleanor's hair had turned almost completely silver, pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a beige coat, her umbrella dripping near the doorway. When she saw me, she smiled, the small, uncertain smile of someone who's not sure if they're still welcome. I stood, just enough for politeness. "You look well," I said. "So do you," she replied, slipping into the chair across from me. "Busier, though. You always were." We sat for a few moments listening to the rain. The barista switched the radio to an old jazz station. Somewhere between the static and the saxophone, I caught the faint rhythm of our shared silence. Finally, she spoke. "Your father wants to see you." I didn't look up from my coffee. "I've seen him my whole life, Mom." She sighed, the sound small-tired. "He's not the same. The trial took everything out of him. The house, the company, his friends. Now he sits by a window all day reading the same newspaper." "Which one?" I asked quietly. She hesitated. "The one with his headline on it." I could almost picture it, the sterile light of a private care home, the white walls smelling faintly of antiseptic and regret. My father, sitting in a wheelchair, hands trembling, the newspaper spread open to the story of his downfall. I imagined him staring at the photo of himself. The powerful man reduced to a headline. Maybe somewhere on the page, buried beneath the scandal, there was still a picture of us as a family. He had once told me that control was everything. Now he couldn't even control the shake in his hands. I took a slow breath. "I don't hate him, Mom. I just don't owe him any more pieces of myself." She nodded, folding her hands around her cup. "He's paying for what he did in his own way. Karma doesn't rush." Her voice trembled slightly when she added, "I know I should have spoken sooner. I let him do too much for too long." "You did what you thought would keep the peace," I said softly. "We all did." The rain outside grew heavier, smearing the reflections of cars on the wet pavement. For a while we didn't talk. Then she reached across the table and touched my hand. Her skin felt cool, but steady. "I'm proud of you," she said. The words landed softly, but sank deep. I met her eyes. "I didn't do anything extraordinary, Mom. I just did the right thing." She smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's extraordinary enough." We sat like that until our coffee turned cold, and the rain began to fade into mist. When she stood to leave, she hesitated, then leaned down and kissed the top of my head like she used to when I was little. Take care of yourself, Maddie. I will. I said. After she left, I stayed at the table, listening to the sound of chairs being moved, the soft hum of the espresso machine. The air smelled of rain and cinnamon. My thoughts drifted to my father sitting by that window in the care home. I imagined his eyes tracing the headline again and again. Former CEO faces trial. I imagined the tear that would fall when he reached the end of the story, realizing that for once there was nothing left to edit. Maybe he regretted what he'd done. Maybe he just regretted being caught. Either way, time had done what I never could. It stripped him of the illusion that he was untouchable. Justice. I thought doesn't need anger to exist. Sometimes it just waits. When I finally stood, I slipped the old notebook into my bag. It felt lighter now, as if the words inside it no longer belonged to me. Outside, the rain had thinned to a drizzle. The street shimmered the puddles, reflecting the faint glow of neon signs. I didn't bother opening my umbrella. The drops felt cool against my skin as I walked toward the intersection, the city breathing around me alive, indifferent. I tilted my face toward the gray sky and let the water wash over me. I used to want him to see me, I whispered. Now, I just want to see myself. The light turned green, and I crossed. The sound of my footsteps mixed with the rhythm of the rain, and for the first time in years, I wasn't walking away from anything. I was simply walking forward. The stage lights were warmer than I expected, bright enough that I could barely see the faces in the audience, only the soft outlines of hundreds of people watching. The conference banner behind me read, Women in Leadership, San Diego, Summer 2025. Somewhere in the front row, Ava smiled, giving me a small nod of encouragement. I took a breath, the microphone cool against my palm. The air in the room was still. A year ago. I began my voice steady. I was told I didn't deserve my family's legacy, that I was too independent, too outspoken, too ungrateful. I paused, feeling the weight of silence press against me. But today I stand here, not because someone gave me a place at the table, but because I built my own. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. I smiled slightly, the kind that comes from remembering pain and realizing it no longer owns you. I used to believe family was everything, I continued. That blood meant loyalty, that love meant sacrifice. But sometimes the people who share your name can be the very ones who try to erase it. The lights softened the sound of the projector flickering behind me as a montage played on the screen. The wedding ballroom shimmering in gold. My father's expression frozen in disbelief. The courtroom sketch of the trial. The quiet image of my mother handing me that final letter. Then came Ava's grin in our new office sunlight, catching the edge of the glass door that read MC, Designs. They asked me after everything that happened, after the company, the scandal, the silence, what I got out of it all. I let the question hang for a moment. The answer is simple. I got freedom. The audience didn't applaud yet. They just listened. That was better. I thought of my father again, not the man who built Carter Interiors, but the one sitting by the window of that care home, staring at the same newspaper headline every morning. For the first time in my life, the image didn't hurt. It simply existed like an old photograph you no longer feel the need to frame. I didn't win because someone lost. I said, I won because I stopped fighting for permission to be who I already was. When the applause finally came, it was soft at first, then built into something full and alive. I stepped back from the microphone, nodded once in thanks, and walked off the stage. Outside the conference hall, the afternoon sun hit the glass doors, flooding the lobby with gold. I stood there for a moment, eyes closed, breathing in the sound of people laughing, the chatter of women exchanging business cards, the hum of possibility. Ava found me near the exit, 2 cups of coffee in hand. You were brilliant, she said. I laughed lightly. I didn't say anything new. You didn't have to, she said, handing me a cup. You said it like someone who lived it. We drove back to the office, the Pacific visible from the highway, a wide stretch of blue that went on forever. When we arrived, the front door was propped open, letting in the smell of salt and warm air. Inside, sunlight poured through the tall windows, glinting off the polished wood desks. Ava set her bag down and started sorting through folders. I walked to my desk and laid a hand on the stack of design plans waiting for review. On the top sheet, our logo shimmered faintly in the light. MCC Designs? For a long moment, I just looked out the window. The ocean stretched beyond the city skyline, calm and endless. The same city where everything had begun and ended and begun again. He gave his son money, I said quietly, half to myself. I made them pay with the truth. Ava glanced up. What was that? Nothing, I said with a faint smile. Just thinking out loud. She grinned, shaking her head, and handed me another cup of coffee. To new beginnings, she said. To peace, I replied. We stood there in silence for a moment, watching the sunlight spill across the floor. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for something to collapse. The world felt steady, balanced. Outside, the waves broke softly against the shore. The sound was distant but steady, like a heartbeat that finally belonged to me again. I turned back to my desk, opened my laptop, and began typing notes for a new client presentation. Nothing about it felt like starting over. It just felt like living. As the light deepened into a soft, amber glow, I caught my reflection in the window, calm, certain, no longer defined by what I'd lost. And in the quiet that followed, I thought about everything I had learned, everything I had survived. The truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. But when it does, it still changes everything. If someone ever tries to silence you, remember this. Truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. It only needs time.